of the Move the Mindset organization.
Thank you. I hope this mic is working.
Yes.
Let me first begin by saying I'm one of the founders of this organization. This organization began about a year and a half ago with 8 people. Last summer we had a press conference and rally, and I was so pleased to announce that our collaboration of organizations who help support us and what we're doing had grown to 5 additional progressive organizations. So we've come from 8 people to 5 organizations as of this past summer. And today, as you will notice when you leave, you will receive a flyer. Please note at the bottom of the flyer, we are now 11 progressive organizations. And by the summer, I hope that we're at 15. So if we have people here who are members of organizations that's not already part of our collaboration, we would love to have you join Move the Mindset. Good evening, and I'd like once again to say welcome and thank you for joining us. Before Dr. Swanson begins his informative and meaningful presentation, I would like to share with you a bit of information about our organization, Move the Mindset. Move the Mindset is an organization committed to addressing our city's sordid past, much of which you will learn of tonight, in order to foster a brighter future for our children and community through education, entertainment, and conversation. The core values of Move the Mindset members and partnering organizations include integrity, respect, unity, and cooperation. Our mandate is to expose the false narratives, misconceptions, and attitudes that continue to create distrust and division in the city of Lafayette. Our goal is to facilitate a citywide conversation about Jim Crow and the Lost Cause movement with a view toward educating our community about why a Jim Crow statue exists in its present location in our city. Our intent is to have the Jim Crow statue removed from its present location in front of the city's Office of International Affairs at the intersection of Lee and Jefferson Streets, and place it in a museum or other contextualized location where its historic significance can be fully understood. Now, I want to repeat that because we have been accused of wanting to destroy the statue, to bury it, to demolish it, and all sorts of things. Damaging that statue is the last thing we want to do. That statue has to be used for educational purposes.
There you go.
It tells one half of the story of Lafayette. There is another half that is not told. But if this statue is placed in a museum, that would be an appropriate place to tell the history of Jim Crow period, as well as the impact that it had on people who live in Lafayette. Did you know there was a time when 50% of the occupants of Lafayette were black people? 50%. They were all slaves. When people are denied health care, living wages, and access to clean water in the richest nation in the world, we must not turn our backs. We cannot turn our backs. Similarly, when the unity of our nation is impeded by the glorification of Jim Crow statutes in furtherance of the preservation and perpetuation of the lost cause movement and its values, including white supremacy, we must not turn our backs. Indeed, we, Move the Mindset, invite you to join our organization and help eradicate obstacles to healthy community relations. We invite you to take a seat at the table and engage in conversation in pursuit of our objective and help us change the mindset. Thank you for coming. We hope you will enjoy Dr. Swanson's presentation. You're about to hear and see a presentation you will never forget for the rest of your life. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred, and I hope everyone can hear me with the microphone on back there. So, no, I'm good. I've got mic here. So I want to thank Move the Mindset for inviting me to your meeting tonight, and I want to thank you all very much for coming. This is important, meaningful history. I got into this about a year ago. I teach political science, and I've taught a lot of Southern history, including Southern civil rights history as part of my classes, like on American government, civil rights law. And a little over a year ago, a friend of my wife's asked me to give a presentation to a local organization about local black history. And I hadn't really studied that, and that set me on this journey of well over a year now of researching this, and I've given all kinds of variations of this presentation as my research has evolved for more than a year now. And so this is my latest incarnation of this, because originally I was just sort of telling a chronology, but I kept having to confront so many very common myths locally about our region's history. So I'm now packaging this presentation as myths, half-myths, and facts to really show you some of the myths that I've heard. And maybe you haven't heard these myths, or maybe you only heard some of them. But I can tell you, having lived here for 20 years and taught, I hear this a lot from people. I've seen this in local history books. I get it a lot from my students when I ask them about what they've learned in their high school civics and history classes. And I've heard all these myths from them, that this is what they were taught in their high school civics and history classes. So these are the myths that I've encountered. And so I'm hopefully going to be clarifying some of the history. And first I want to warn you, a lot of this is very disturbing. A lot of this history is very unpleasant. And just like we couldn't talk about what happened in World War II and the Holocaust of Jewish people without getting into some graphic facts, some very disturbing, troubling facts, there's going to be some very disturbing, troubling facts and things you're going to hear and even see throughout this presentation. So you have been warned. So we're going to begin, just to show you some of the stuff that I've done is pour through parish records, courthouses, city halls, Freedmen's Bureau reports, census data, Civil War correspondence, all kinds of primary documents. Because it's there, it's just been hidden, and I'll explain why it's been hidden towards the end of the presentation. And most importantly, though, what I want to explain, one of the points, is that there isn't white or black history. It'd be like trying to tell the story of a marriage, but only telling the story of one person and never mentioning the fact that they were married. You know, this has been a relationship we've had in this part of Louisiana for the last several hundred years. And so if you're going to tell the history of this region, there's no white history or black history. There's our history of a shared interaction, a shared relationship. It's just that because only one half has been told, now this is only telling the other half here. I'm going to focus on it. Oh, thank you. Yeah. But it really is our history. And hopefully someday this presentation won't be needed because everyone will already know the full, complete history. So this is a half myth that I've often heard. This area was founded by the French and Spanish. This is partially true, but let's look at the stats. First of all, the first founders were the Native Americans, and that would be worthy of its own separate presentation. I don't have time to get into that. But let's look at what I call the modern founding. Here is census data of the population demographics going back for quite some time. And if you notice, as early as 1774, a third of the population was people of African descent. Over 40% by 1785 in what was called the Attakapaw region that Lafayette Parish eventually became carved out of. And by 1820, right before Lafayette Parish was founded, in the Attakapaw region, a majority of the population was African descent. Lafayette Parish then, in the 1860 census, 52% African descent. That included almost all of them enslaved. And of the 22 parishes that today comprise what the state has defined as Acadiana, 60% of the population was people of African descent. So that was a majority of the population. So if we're going to be honest here, what we need to say is that this area was primarily founded by people of African descent and secondarily by people of French and Spanish descent. And again, it's right there in the U.S. Census records. You can go online. By the way, at each of these facts, I'm going to put here where you can go online. Anyone can go online. Just look up U.S. Census records for that time period. You can see the data yourself. You can verify everything I'm saying on your own. I've heard this from students. Sometimes I've seen it online in discussion forums. Oh, slavery was good and it was benevolent. Well, let's look at the facts here. The Louisiana Slave Code, what they call the Code Noir, the Black Code. Of course, it forbade marriage. Your family can be ripped apart at any time. Your spouse sold off, your children sold off, your siblings, your parents. And we have actually testimony of people that were enslaved here in Lafayette Parish and surrounding parishes. During the Great Depression, the federal government tried to find work for unemployed people, and part of that was unemployed writers. And they sent writers out across the South to find people, this was in the 1930s, who had been enslaved when they were much younger, to try to record these stories before these people died, and we lost those stories forever. And so they're called the Federal Writers Project Slave Narratives. And here we have just a few of the testimonies from people in this area. And they talk about how they were, now this isn't necessarily every one of them said this, but it was very common. They said they were beaten and they were whipped. Salt was sometimes rubbed in the wounds to make it more painful. Owners raped their enslaved women in order to have more slaves, and they often just kept their children enslaved and even sold off their own children and kept them in slavery. Young girls who were enslaved were forced to allow themselves to be raped by other slaves because the owner said you needed to make more babies, you needed to make more money. And both the women that were interviewed who had been enslaved in Iberia, they talked about how when pregnant women were going to be punished and whipped, they would dig a hole in the ground, have her lay with her belly in the ground to protect the unborn baby, and then they would whip her. Because, and this was in their words, the children were worth money. And we have corroborating evidence. When the Union soldiers came through here and liberated a lot of the slaves, we have all kinds of testimony about how they saw the horrors of slavery. And this is just one example where when some of these men joined Union forces and they went through medical exams. Here we have Lawrence Van Elstein. He was a northern soldier here. And he says some of them were scarred from head to foot where they had been whipped. One man's back was nearly all one scar. And this is locally. He was recruiting, in his memoir, he was recruiting black soldiers who had been slaves in Lafayette Parish. And when he took them for medical care, this is what he saw. Now, you might have seen this photo. This is probably the most common photo. Who here has seen this photo before? Yeah, it's probably the single most common photo of showing the direct brutality of slavery. His name was Gordon, and he was from St. Lambert Parish. So this is very local. And this is the point, is that how was slavery enforced? It was through whippings, it was through beatings, at any time. If you did anything to offend or disobey your owner, you could be beaten and whipped. And in Lafayette Parish, as all the other surrounding parishes, they created a system of what were called slave patrols. Basically, groups of armed white men on horseback would travel around the parish, and they would have lists of all the slaves on all the plantations, and they would check to make sure you're there. And if you weren't, they would hunt you down. And if there was anyone who was there who wasn't supposed to be there, they would whip you as well. The punishment was 25 lashes of the whip. Now, I want you to think about this. The whip, if a person makes a whip, you've seen this in movies, the whip makes a cracking sound. When the end, it goes whoosh. That is actually a mini sonic boom. The end of the whip is traveling faster than the sound barrier, and that's why it does that. And that's 737 miles an hour. So if you knew how to use a whip, you were slicing a person's back with a piece of leather going at, even if it wasn't exactly 737, several hundred miles an hour. And that's what happens. And a lot of times people died from blood loss or infection of the wounds because there wasn't penicillin back then. And so this was just absolutely brutal. In fact, Gordon said that after he was whipped, he was in bed sort of delirious for a month, just recovering. And I mean, it's lucky that he survived that. We had, what's remarkable is that even how brutal it was, knowing that you could be tortured or murdered if you tried to escape and resist, still enslaved people did try that. There was an attempted slave rebellion in 1840. There's only a few references to it in local history books. When I did the research and found some of the, and there's only a few newspaper articles at the time that even survived and talked about this, but the leader's name was Eugene, so I've just started calling it Eugene's Rebellion. But it was a plot. Unfortunately, one of his fellow, there were a couple dozen, were going to try to escape enslavement. Unfortunately, one of their fellow slaves told about the plot before they could implement it, and according to the newspaper reports at the time, all but 3 were executed, and Eugene committed suicide in jail while awaiting execution, because it wasn't ordinary execution at the time. What they would do would be torture you as in public as a show to other slaves. Don't you dare try to rebel, don't you dare try to escape, because this is what's going to happen to you. So he realized, rather than be tortured alive, I'm just going to end it now. And one other participant was put in leg irons and stocks at night for 2 years. Now stocks is that thing you've seen where your head and arms sort of go through this big wood that clamps down, sometimes metal. So if you think about that, that's torture. That's a form of torture, and this was done publicly, again, as assigned to other people who were enslaved. Don't you dare try to escape, don't you dare try to rebel against your enslavement, because this is what's going to happen to you. And that's the point, is that even if you read slave narratives, and some of the people say, well, I was never beaten, I was never whipped. But that's because they knew that if they did, that's what could happen. So everyone who was enslaved lived under the constant terror, the constant fear of, I better do whatever I need to avoid that happening to me. It sort of reminds me, and I don't know if you know, it's one of the most famous Twilight Zone episodes where there's this little boy who has psychic powers, but he's a tyrant, and all his family just smiles and nods their heads and does whatever he says because they know he's going to murder them if they don't do what he says. Well, that was it. It was just that family was living in constant terror, and that's what this was like. You have to do whatever it takes to survive. So it was barbaric. And again, you can look up, just Google Federal Writer slave narratives. You can read all of them, thousands of pages from Louisiana and all across the South. Another common myth I've heard, there wasn't much slavery around here. Well, here, again, all we have to do is look at the census records. But before I get to that, let's talk about the economics of this. Rivers, bayous were the highways at the time. And because back then they flooded every or most springs, and that water would fertilize the land adjacent to the rivers, so that was the prime real estate to have agricultural land along rivers and bayous. And the same is true here in Lafayette Parish. The Bayou Vermilion and the Bayou Tortue had a little bit more settlement along at the time. But here's the point, is that when you look at land records, or I should say tax records of the time, ownership of human beings as slaves, that brought in more taxation to this parish and the surrounding parish. It was the single biggest source of wealth in this area, even more than land. And it wasn't just slave owners that were dependent on that, because most of the economy then was agricultural. And pretty much if you owned a business at all, where are you getting your money from? The people who are making money from slavery. And your employees then are dependent on slavery. And so a whole lot of, not just the slave owners themselves, but a lot of the economy was dependent on this slave-based economy. And let's look at the statistics. This is by states here. You see ranking of percent of the population enslaved. And yes, a majority of the population in South Carolina and Mississippi were enslaved. In Louisiana, it was 45%. And it would be much higher if you exclude New Orleans. Here you see rankings of percent of households with slaves. And this is a common myth all across the South. People say, oh, there was only 2% or 6% of Southerners were slave owners. That's because in the census, it only attributed ownership to the head of the household. But if you look at the families that owned slaves, here's the statistics then. In Louisiana, it was 29%. But again, if you went outside of, it's much lower because of New Orleans. If you don't count in New Orleans, that number is much higher. So yes, slave ownership across the South was much higher than most people have commonly understood. And let's look at the statistics here, again from the census records. Lafayette Parish, 50% of the population enslaved. 47% of the free families in Lafayette Parish owned at least one slave, enslaved at least one or more people. Now, if you rank that as states, that would mean Lafayette Parish would be ranked third of the state, or second in a state, if it was a state, in ownership, family ownership of slaves. And if you look at the 22 modern parishes, or 22 parishes that are today defined as Acadiana, 58% of the population was enslaved. Acadiana, if it was a state, would have been ranked the highest percentage of slavery in the entire South. That's amazing. And so really the point is that slavery was more entrenched or concentrated, or whatever word you want to use for it, more in Lafayette Parish than the rest of the South on average, even the rest of the Deep South on average. And again, you can look at the census records. I've heard this one as well, and sometimes people say, well, you know, there was a lot of slavery, but the Cajuns, they didn't own any slaves. Well, one scholar looked at census data for 1850 and actually looked at the individual names and determined that about 68% of slave owners in the parish were French Acadian. Here you see the largest slave owners in Lafayette Parish. Now this is 1860 data. You see the names there. And just looking through the 1860 census data myself, they have what was called slave schedules, where they actually would have each family name and then the number of slaves. This is just some of them. It's really hard to read. This kind of research, it's hard to do because I'm looking online at old photocopies of really old, basically photocopies of microfilm that itself was made from really old documents that have faded, and they wrote in handwriting in old pens in the 1860s, and they didn't care about spelling at the time very much. So it's really hard to figure out exactly all these names. But there you can see a list of some of the slave owners that had 10 or more slaves, and there's a lot more names that had fewer than 10. But again, the point is that, you know, and I haven't calculated an exact statistic, but the point is that a lot of Cajuns owned a lot of slaves. This is the #1 myth. Even when somebody I'll talk to and I say, I agree, you've proven everything else, but no, the South wasn't fighting for slavery. I just can't believe that. I've never heard, I've been told it was something else my whole life. I've heard of states' rights and secession and constitutional liberty and all this kind of stuff. That is absolute rubbish. They themselves, at the time, when Southern whites seceded and formed the Confederacy and began fighting, they uniformly said it was because they wanted to keep 4 million people enslaved. And it wasn't just slavery due to conquest like it traditionally happened throughout the history of the planet. This was slavery based on the theory that the white race was superior to the black race because God had created it that way. And so it was a very particular type of theory based on slavery. And here you see just one of the more famous quotes by the Vice President of the Confederacy. And by the way, the Vice President of the Confederacy gave this speech to the Virginia Secession Convention when they hadn't decided yet whether to secede and join the Confederacy, because the Confederacy had formed and then a few more states were deciding whether to join the Confederacy. And he gives this presentation to the Virginia Secession Convention and he says, I'm here to tell you why we exist as a Confederacy and why you should join us. And this is what he says. And by the way, sitting next to him, or in the guest of honor boxes when he gave the speech, was Robert E. Lee. And look what he says. He says, the Negro is not equal to the white man. Slavery is his natural and normal condition. And he says, this, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. So there was, he was right, it was the first one based on this notion. There was a second nation that was based upon the idea that there was something superior about the white race, and that was Nazi Germany. Here you see Lafayette Parish voted 80% for the pro-slavery candidate in the 1860 election, compared to 45% overall for Louisiana, so much higher there. When it came time to vote for delegates to the secession convention, and the delegates ran either as pro or anti-secession, Louisiana total actually was only 52% of the delegates, or 52% of the vote was pro-secession. In Lafayette Parish, 87%. And who was the the president of the Louisiana Secession Convention? Lafayette Parish's own Alexander Bouchon, the former governor. So the point here is that Lafayette Parish was at the forefront of secession in Louisiana. This is, yeah, they said they were all fighting to keep slavery. And by the way, at the end, remind me, I'm going to give you a link where you can go online and find, I have to count up the number of quotes, but about 100 pages of quotes from Confederate leaders explaining that it was all about slavery. I'll talk about that later. And by the way, this is all, it's all going to be publicly available. I'll give you that link where you can go online and verify it all for yourself using publicly available, public domain documents, such as old newspapers, old congressional records, and that sort of thing. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. It's a little bit tangential, but this is very common around here, and especially in South Louisiana. Those Union forces, those Yankees did nothing, but they were evil, and they came through and plundered this area. I say it's mostly that, because yes, there was some plundering, because it was war, and you're always going to have some plundering in war, but Confederate forces did a whole lot of plundering too. They were under direct orders, the Confederate forces were under direct orders to destroy anything that might fall into Union hands. So they were burning down buildings, burning crops, and they were also taking all the animals to feed themselves. So they did just as much plundering as, at least as much, under direct orders to do so by actually Jefferson Davis. But here's the point. Here's where the big difference is. Union forces came through and liberated people. They liberated thousands of enslaved people in South Central Louisiana. And in fact, at the Battle of Pinhook Bridge, which literally took place right where the Pinhook Bridge is today, that's the historic location of the Pinhook Bridge, when Union forces were able to defeat Confederate forces there and come through Lafayette Parish, that meant that thousands of people in this parish, and also thousands more in surrounding parishes were able to be liberated from enslavement. And here's what's also interesting. I had never heard this. I'd never read this anywhere. And in reading through the Civil War correspondence, Union General Banks, who was the Union leader that came through this area, he writes to the War Department in Washington, D.C., and he says, he wasn't plundering, he was confiscating. And he says, I turn over all this plantation property to the Treasury Department for the support of war refugees. He was engaged in humanitarian relief efforts for thousands of people that had no jobs, had no homes, needed medical care, they needed food and clothing. And he says, and this is the most interesting thing, he says the administration of these charities and providing for the increase have been a labor of far greater intensity and suffering than the creation of an army and the conduct of campaigns. So here he's saying, I'm spending more time and money and energy providing humanitarian relief than I am actually fighting any war. That's what he was doing with this, most of the stuff he confiscated. Now, if you look what the Confederates were doing, though, they were going around widespread enslaving people, re-enslaving people who had been liberated by Union forces. They were under orders to murder any black Union soldier or their white commanders as if on the grounds that they were leading a slave insurrection. So if we're going to compare who was committing the more war crimes, it was the Confederate forces that, even let's say, I know they weren't following today's standards of war crimes, but if we do follow today's standards of war crimes, the Confederate forces were the ones committing far more and far worse war crimes than any Union forces were around here. The War of the Rebellion was compiled by the U.S. government right after the Civil War. It's tens of thousands of pages of Civil War correspondence, both by the Union and Confederate forces. So here's sort of a half myth. Well, locally we fought for the South. Well, it's true, a lot of people around here did fight for the South, but that's leaving out all the people who fought for the North. From Louisiana, there were over 24,000 what were called at the time U.S. colored troops. If you join the Union forces, yes, they were segregated units, but here, most remarkably, Gordon, we saw him earlier, he joined Union forces and then fought for the Union. And in looking through Freedmen's Bureau records, the Freedmen's Bureau was in charge of distributing discharge bonuses from the Union Army. And I found in the Freedmen's Bureau, there was one here in Vermilionville, right after the Civil War, and I found a list of Union soldiers, U.S. colored troops, that were claiming these discharge bonuses. And I was able to verify a lot of these, yes, from the National Park Service, saying, yes, these were Union soldiers that came from Lafayette Parish. They received discharge bonuses here. And in fact, in Washington, D.C., this is a partial photo of the African American Civil War Memorial in Washington, D.C. It has the names of every single member of the U.S. colored troops that fought for the Union on the base here. And interestingly, one of these members of the U.S. colored troops from Lafayette Parish, black, not white, the name was Alfred Mouton. And now there were a lot of others, but I just give that there for interesting comparison. So maybe we could replace the white Alfred Mouton with a statue to black Alfred Mouton. So here's the point. Although, yes, tens of thousands of Louisianans and many locally did fight for the Confederacy, that story gets left off because about a third of all Louisianans that fought in the Civil War fought for the Union. A third of all Louisianans that fought for the Union. Now, once you end the Civil War, you come to the period of U.S. history known as Reconstruction. And yes, the South had been destroyed physically, but that's not what they meant by, and it had to be rebuilt, but that's not what was meant by Reconstruction. The institution, like the United States, had been torn apart and needed to be reconstructed, but also the Southern society, the white supremacist society, the basis of law and politics, the slavery in the South, all that had been destroyed. So society needed to be rebuilt or reconstructed now on a basis of racial equality. And so this period of history, for about the next decade or so after the Civil War, is known as Reconstruction. Now, there's this narrative that Southern whites have often told that, well, that was just corrupt black government and whites were reclaiming what was rightfully theirs. But here's what happened during Reconstruction. Those who didn't want equality labeled the Republicans. Forget what you know about modern political parties or modern political labels. Lincoln was a Republican. The Republicans were, in favor of racial equality. It was the Democratic Party, especially almost all whites in the South were a part of the Southern Democratic Party, and they were against racial equality. Well, so the Democratic Party, who were against racial equality, labeled any Republican who was in favor of racial equality as radical. As they said, that was a radical notion to have racial equality. So when you hear this term, historically, radical Republicans, that's what they meant. It was just they just wanted equality. But that was considered radical at the time by a lot of people. So all they wanted was racial equality, and they did pass, the Republican Congress passed all kinds of civil rights laws, passed civil rights amendments to the U.S. Constitution, and U.S. troops in the South were enforcing these civil rights laws, allowing black voter registration. Blacks were elected to office, including locally Alexander Fortuné Riard. Who here is other than my presentations? If you could, I know several of you have been here to hear me before. Who here has ever heard of Alexander Fortuné Riard? Exactly. He was a black elected official, and he was elected as the delegate from Lafayette Parish to write a new Louisiana Constitution after the Civil War that would include racial equality. And it did. The 1867 Louisiana Constitution was rewritten. The convention was 1867, and by 1868 they had a new Louisiana Constitution that required equality in voting, racial equality with integrated schools. The Constitution prohibited businesses from discriminating on the basis of race. It was the 1964 Civil Rights Act 100 years earlier. But the problem was there weren't enough union forces in the South. They were spread too thin. You just couldn't occupy the entire South. And so, because, remember, blacks were a majority of the population. How do you stop blacks from voting? How do you stop them from getting elected if they're a majority? You have to turn to terrorism, and this is what whites did. Southern whites systematically turned to terrorism through organizations like the KKK and others. There were other terrorist organizations that were bigger locally. The Knights of the White Camellia around 1968, and then later the White League around 1874, 1868 and 1874. And you read through newspaper accounts of the time and Freedmen's Bureau reports, systematic murders, assassinations. Now, there were no massacres here in Lafayette Parish, but there was one right in Opelousas, where historical records are unclear, but between 20-something and maybe 200 blacks were killed by whites. And so there were several massacres all around Louisiana. And what's important is that the white prosecutors, judges, juries would not convict. And in all these massacres and murders and assassinations across Louisiana, there was not one conviction ever. Not one. And here you see, because of this terrorism, here you see the election results in Grant. This was Ulysses Grant, the Union general who is now running for president. Zero votes in Lafayette Parish. The systematic terrorism was so successful, even though, remember, blacks had been a majority of the population, yet not one vote for the civil rights candidate. That's how successful systematic terrorism was against blacks and against any Republican voting. Well, now the problem is Reconstruction ended in 1877. The rest of the country said, well, we're just tired of babysitting the South. We'll just let them return. And, well, now what happened was white supremacy returned. But here's the point. Reconstruction after the Civil War was an attempt to create racial equality in the South. Southern whites, including locally, systematically blocked that effort through anti-black terrorism and violence. So then sometimes I hear from people, well, you know, after Reconstruction ended, then we have this long period known as Jim Crow. It just happened to be named after an old minstrel character named Jim Crow. And that period of 100 or so years of history, it wasn't so bad. We had peace and quiet and everyone got along. About 2 years ago at a city council meeting about the Alfred Wheaton statue, an older white gentleman stood up and he said, oh, these people that want to move the statue to a museum, they're just causing trouble. We've never had a race problem in Lafayette. Well, he didn't know any of this history. I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt and say he was just really, he did not know about any of the history. But let's look at the reality of it. And this, by the way, every one of these slides, as you can imagine, would be worth an entire presentation in itself. I'm trying to skim through this just for time constraints because there's so much to this history. And yes, I am in the process of writing a book on all this, which I hope to have the manuscript done by the end of this year and hopefully maybe published in 2019. But, so what happened was, once Southern whites, including Louisiana, retook power through terrorism, then now that they were elected in office, they used that power of voting. They threw out the old Louisiana Constitution that had racial equality. They now put in white supremacy back into the Constitution. In fact, the Advocate and the Advertiser both recently had articles about just one small piece of this, where they had some excerpts of quotes from the 1898 Constitutional Convention where they quoted some of the whites were saying, yes, we're trying to restore white supremacy in this Constitution. And it was so successful that from 1900 to 1960, 100% of all elected officials in all the states of the former Confederacy were white. 100%. That's how successful this discrimination was. And how was this enforced? Systematic laws, terrorism, lynchings. And by the way, people tend to think of lynchings as a news thing. But what was very common, when you go back and read about the murders of people at the time, it was typically torture. You were tortured alive first. You were shot, you were stabbed. Being burned alive was very common. And then your murdered body was hung up as a symbol to everyone else. If you challenge the status quo, this is what's going to happen to you. So it was very rare that you were actually killed just from the hanging. It was from other, as you go back into the early 1900s, it was typically from some other way you were murdered, and then your body was hung as a symbol. And you have super extensive segregation, you have economic oppression. Just to give you an example here, in Lafayette Parish in 1915, actually it was the city of Lafayette in 1915, said that if you're seen, two people of different races are seen hanging out together at a home or business or just anywhere in public, you're now defined as criminal vagrants, and you can be arrested. So right now, all of us are criminal vagrants in 1915. And that didn't end until federal civil rights laws in the 1960s. Here's another example. In 1923, Lafayette, the city, passed a racial zoning ordinance where they defined by streets. They said there's going to be only two Negro communities, which is the term they used in Lafayette, in the city of Lafayette. And these are the boundaries as best as I could approximate, because some of the street names had changed, and I had to look at old maps and try to figure it out. It's basically what today we know as the Laplace and the Vise neighborhoods. Not Macomb Vise, just Vise back then. And so that's where they said everywhere else in the city was defined as a white community. And if you were black, you could only live or own a business in those two boundaries, within those two enclaves. Now what's interesting is that they did perceive that the population might expand. And so what they did was, and I need to maybe make this a dotted line, the outer sort of, we see this arrow here, this outer northwest boundary of this Laplace neighborhood, and the outer southeast boundary of Vise was defined as being the corporate boundary. So that if the corporate boundary expanded, then this enclave would expand out. Now here's 2010 census data, demographic data, and look at the remarkable similarity. That's a century later, and we still see the patterns of that ordinance. It's remarkable. Now, we went beyond just physical separation, known as segregation. There was intense economic oppression. And again, this would be worthy of a whole presentation itself. Sharecropping kept a lot of, and by the way, there's an excellent book and now a documentary film based on the book called Slavery by Another Name. And it talks about sharecropping, the convict leasing system, where basically, remember I said, okay, so all of us would be criminal vagrants in 1915, and if we can't afford to pay the fines, guess what? We're now set to work. And even if we can't pay the fines, if we're sentenced to a prison term, guess what? Now we have to work. And so all we have to do is trump up charges against any of you, and now you get to be essentially slave labor. And that was done all across the South. So there were extremely few educational opportunities if you were black. For example, all of the legal and political systems, it was white only, and that includes judges, lawyers, police. Pretty much at the time, if you were black, there were only a few jobs that were quote-unquote allowed to you. Manual labor, entertainers, teachers, but only teachers in black schools, and ministers for black congregations. Even, just to give you another example of how systematic it was, the GI Bill, the GI Bill was great for white GIs. But what Southern senators and members of Congress got put in the GI Bill was that they allowed the GI Bill to be administered locally. So the local Southern whites administered it to make sure that whites got all the good benefits and got to go to good schools, and those benefits were largely denied to black GIs. Here's another example. This is Lafayette Parish High School. You see on the left, the white high school, large palace, concrete, brick. There is what was called Paul Grove High School back then. Basically, it's a shack, a wooden shack. But everything else was, you've heard of separate but equal, but that was a myth. It was never separate but equal. It was always separate and highly unequal. Most area towns around here in Lafayette Parish and across all of the South, they did not allow a 12th grade education if you were black. The high school would only maybe be 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, but not 12th grade for the black high schools. The subjects taught in the white schools were very different. They would prepare you for advanced careers, like technical careers and professional careers, not so in the black schools. No transportation was provided to the black schools. And Greg, I saw you, Greg, what year was it that Lafayette Parish finally started to provide transportation? Because you were part of the protest. 71. It wasn't until 1971 that Lafayette Parish would even provide transportation for black students. 1971. Thanks, Rick. And black teachers' pay was half of white pay. I had one gentleman at one of my presentations who said afterwards that they would get the hand-me-down books from the white students, and often like the exercises and the answer keys, like at the end of, let's say, a math book or whatever, were all ripped out. So you couldn't even learn the math because you didn't have any way to practice, you didn't have the answer keys. So it was nothing anywhere close to separate but equal. It was always separate and highly unequal. And so in some, you see these two very radically different worlds for whites and blacks. The whites and blacks were literally living in two different worlds, both physically and metaphysically. Now, how do you know if this law would have applied to you? All of this intense segregation and oppression. Under Louisiana law, you were defined as black if you had any trace of African ancestry, either visible or known. So even if you tried to pass as white, which many people were able to do if they had, let's say, your great-great-great-grandmother was black, and you could just say, oh, I'm white, and you wouldn't be subject to this. But if someone somewhere found a record showing your great-great-grandmother was black, or someone knew from oral history, no, your great-great-great-grandmother was black. That's it. You are now defined as black, and you're subject to all of this discrimination and oppression. The whites at the time were obsessed with racial purity. Now, what effect did all this oppression have? Well, historians, I didn't come up with this term, historians have called this for many decades the Great Migration. That Southern blacks said, this is so oppressive, it's not going to be perfect, and there was still a lot of segregation and oppression outside the South, but it wasn't as bad. And they said, we're going to take our chances leaving the South to go to the North or West. And so here you see the drop in the black population in the South, and then I calculated the drop in the black population in Louisiana and in Lafayette Parish. And you see the Lafayette Parish, the drop in percent from, remember, a majority black population in 1860 all the way down to around 25% in 2000. And it only began to rebound. This was around 1970 to 1980. It only began to rebound once civil rights really took effect. And people said, okay, we now finally at least have some hope of legal equality here. We don't need to leave. And actually some people began returning to the South. So the fact is that Jim Crow era segregation and economic oppression was severe. And it was enforced by violence when needed. Another myth I've heard, well, you know, at least we were better. Jim Crow ended here just like that, no problem. Well, I guess I should say it's partially true in the sense that we didn't have, you know, water cannons and attack dogs like you see in some of the films. But just to give you an example about how much systematic white resistance there was to integration, I got a hold of some old educational directories and looked at the enrollment records for Lafayette and the surrounding parishes, right at just at the time of Brown versus Board of Education, ruling that illegal. And then I went a decade in the future, and if you notice that segregation for all but a couple of the parishes in South Central Louisiana increased in the decade after Brown versus Board of Education. There was systematic resistance, lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit, and the parish here, the cities, all around, they did everything they could to resist integration. And so these figures are very powerful. And if you look at just that change, Lafayette was actually worst of all the surrounding parishes. And you might say, well, at least that meant more students were going to school. Yeah, but they were going to segregated schools. That the schools were not integrated until, actually it was a court order, I believe it was 1971. I'm still doing a lot of research, reading through all the cases. But it wasn't until the early 70s that a court finally said, that's it, you will integrate now because you resisted it for 15 years. Oh, and here you see the citizens' councils were across the South, and that was sort of the leading, white group that said, we need to keep segregation and all this kind of stuff. And here you see their logo and their motto: states' rights, meaning the right of the state to segregate. That's what they said was the right of the state to control their own education system. And their other motto, racial integrity, meaning racial purity. They did not want the races to mix. And what's interesting is they had a show that they showed across the South. It was shown weekly on KLFY TV. I've been trying to find copies of any of those. If anyone knows where to find an old copy of one of their actual TV shows, I'd love to get a hold of that. But I was able to get a hold of some of their old magazines, and they had essay contests for high school students. And why should the races remain separate? And these high school students, and these are honor roll students, valedictorians, writing and saying, because they were the winners of these essay contests, saying we must keep the races separate because if they're mixed, they might actually have relationships, they might fall in love, they might have sex, and that will degrade the purity of the white race. And this was their philosophy. So that's why they were obsessed with keeping the races separate. They wanted to maintain the purity of the white race. So it was slow and difficult. I don't know if she's here, but one person always says, what about UL? Well, they used to say it was effortless. Now I think they're being much more honest now to saying, yeah, it only was after a lawsuit filed by the NCAA, led by Thurgood Marshall, who then became a Supreme Court justice. And technically, the lawsuit was 1954. It was actually just before Brown versus Board of Education, and it was technically based, college law was a little bit different than high school, so it wasn't based on Brown versus Board of Education. But technically, all the ruling did was say you had to let black students into the classroom. So that's what you all did. You were allowed in the classroom, but everything else on campus was still segregated. The library, the dorms, the cafeteria, the student organizations, the athletics, everything else. And it wasn't until about a decade later, about 1963-64 academic year, that everything began to be integrated. All right, so here's the big question. Why so many local historical myths? Fred, in this presentation, mentioned the lost cause. So imagine this, right? You've lost a war. Your country, quote unquote, has been destroyed. More than 500,000 Americans have died. And you fought to keep 4 million human beings enslaved based on this notion of white supremacy. This is not a good story to tell. You don't want to tell that story. So for psychological reasons, understandable psychological reasons, but not excusable. The Southern whites said, we need to rewrite this history. We're in charge now. We use terrorism to get in charge. Let's require that all school books tell a different story. And let's have books and films tell a different story. And they even gave it a name. They called it the lost cause of the Confederacy, where they said, well, we were fighting this glorious struggle for freedom and liberty and independence, and the only reason we lost, we were doomed from the start because of the overwhelming manpower and resources of the North, and hence the term, the lost cause. So what was the elements of this lost cause? It was a war of northern aggression, or a war for southern independence. It was about states' rights, or property rights, or constitutional rights, or whatever else they would come up with. But notice they never said what states' right, what property were you fighting for? What right of the state did the South say they wanted that the North didn't have? The right to determine where their capital was located? Or the right to have elections for the state legislature? The southern states had every right that the northern states did, except for one. The northern states were saying, we don't like the fact you're creating slavery. And that was the state's right that they wanted to keep. And of course, under this narrative, the slaves were happy and loyal. It was those darn Yankees that came and ruined this system and it made everybody happy. It was this noble southern way of life. Reconstruction, and after the Civil War, was that white struggle against corrupt black government and their treacherous white allies, known as scalawags and carpetbaggers and whatever other terms we want to use. And then, in the South, Southern films or Southern-friendly films like Birth of a Nation, 1916, glorified the KKK. Gone with the Wind glorifies the Confederacy. The KKK was actually the heroes in the first Birth of a Nation. And Birth of a Nation, it was sort of the first epic film. I mean, it was sort of like the Lord of the Rings or something of, and I'm not meaning to be facetious, but it was this epic, sweeping film for 1916, huge hit all around the country. And so this is how, not just Southern whites, but people all across the country were seeing Birth of a Nation going, oh, this is Southern history, this is based on Southern history. And without even thinking, this lost cause narrative got spread all throughout the country and the world. And so you had lots of other books and films. These are just a couple of examples. And so this lost cause narrative got spread all around the country and the world. I found articles in Louisiana newspapers, for example, where the Daughters of the Confederacy said, we want to make sure that all books in all classrooms in Louisiana only tell the lost cause. And the State Board of Education director writes back and says, yes, I promise, we will only tell correct Southern history. And so it was systematically required across the South that only the lost cause version could be told, not just in elementary and high schools, but even in college textbooks. And I actually found a bunch of these old college textbooks that they had approved. And it's pure, almost pure, just all lost cause narrative. False, completely false versions of Southern history. And then they built monuments at the time. And so now we need to, because we want to glorify the lost cause and its heroes, and this was a common phrase, the lost cause and its heroes. When they were in the early planning stages of the Alfred Mouton statue, they said, we need to glorify the lost cause and its heroes. This was the Sons of Confederate Veterans meeting at the time. This was late 1906 or 10. Before they built the statue, they said, we need to glorify the lost cause and its heroes. And then a decade and a half later, the Alfred Mouton statue was built. And here you see, so during this time period when they were trying to glorify the lost cause and its heroes, these monuments were put up all across the South, including a lot in Louisiana. And sometimes they were actually very honest at the time because they had no reason not to be. They said, what do we care? We're going to say, we're fighting for white supremacy. We're fighting for white supremacy. We're going to recognize the good darkies. This is actually what they put in the transcripts of the inscriptions in these statues. And there's some others in the area that just don't have space for it put up there. But here's the point. Because you had all textbooks and teachers, high school and civics teachers, high school civics and history teachers were trained, college civics and history teachers were trained in the South with only the lost cause movement. So when they taught their students, and they taught students who were going to school to be teachers, they learned only the lost cause movement. And this got perpetuated for generation and generation. And so still today, the lost cause narrative exists not just in the South, but the entire U.S. To a large degree. There was just a poll that the Southern Poverty Law Center took, and it was, I can't remember the exact number, but it was around only 10% of high school students nationwide could identify slavery as the cause of the Civil War. A lot of them say, oh, it was states' rights. Well, what right? Oh, I don't know, I've just always heard that phrase, states' rights. But here's the point, that this narrative still deeply impacts, especially our region's history. So here, just as an example, and I don't mean to pick on New Iberia, it's just that this is a very powerful visual example. Here is a large public mural that's about on a wall this size in downtown New Iberia. You can't see it from the main street. It's on there's a pavilion in downtown New Iberia, and this is on the back side, so it's like facing the Bayou Teche. So if you go around behind there, you see this big mural, and the plaque right there says it was created in 2007. And this is supposed to tell the history of New Iberia. And actually, you can't read it from the red. If you go up to the actual wall, you can read here. This scroll talks about the Acadian settlers, and this scroll talks about the Spanish settlers. But look at the statistics here of the first Acadian and Spanish settlers. 41% African descent in 1785, 46% African descent of the first Spanish settlement in 1779. That's right, the very first founding, the first Spanish settlers in New Iberia brought with them enslaved Africans that comprised almost half of the entire population. So and by the way, by 1860, at the start of the Civil War, the area around New Iberia was 68% of the population was people of African descent, almost all enslaved. So where is that history here? Oh, there's a little bit right there is a black musical band from the early 1900s. That's black history for New Iberia, according to this public mural. So you see why this is a very powerful visual example of what's going on in books. And I've gone around and looked at Wikipedia websites that talk about parish and city histories across South Central Louisiana. I've looked at tourism websites where they, not all, it's getting better, but a lot of them, the tourism websites only mention French and Spanish people. Clerk of courts, again, I'm not going to mention any particular names, but look at the clerk of courts websites and city government websites and parish websites for this whole region of South Central Louisiana, and see how much of this history they're telling versus just saying, oh, it was the French and Spanish, and they came here, and they made a lot of money, and that was it. So, again, this is just a powerful visual example of how the lost cause movement still deeply affects how we tell our region's history. So a lot of false myths locally. So what can you do? Well, now that you know, you can correct this. Find out what history books your kids are using in elementary school and high school or college. Look at websites and see, around the region and see how they're telling local history. Go to local museums and see how they're telling our region's history. Look at murals, films, school lessons, historical symbols. Here, I'll give you a positive example. Here's how it can, now this is just a very, very tiny example, but it's a powerful visual example that makes an important point. The University of Louisiana became the University of Louisiana, changed its name, that is, from the University of Southwestern Louisiana, in 1999. Their old seal was actually only depicted French and Spanish heritage. And in fact, the gentleman who designed the Acadiana flag in 1964 said that he based the design of the Acadiana flag on this seal. And you can see the similarity there. Well, it would make sense that they only portrayed French and Spanish heritage because when UL was founded in 1898, 1999, it was segregated. It was white only all the way up until 1954. So UL became a university officially a University of Louisiana in 1999. They said, we're not being honest about our historical heritage, and that means we're not being inclusive to the people that do make up the heritage of this region, so let's change it. And so they did. And now their official seal, which is on their website and on the podiums at graduations and whatnot, it's French, Spanish, and West African heritage, because most of the enslaved people in the South, or at least especially in Louisiana, came from West Africa, because that's where France at the time had its colonies that they enslaved people. That was West Africa. So, it's very simple to do. They just designed it, and that's the point. All you do is start being honest. You just start saying, okay, we're going to be complete and accurate about our local history, about our local heritage. And here's the even bigger point, so I want to leave with you hopefully this inspiration. There's some important reasons why we want to be honest about history, especially around here. If you have a false notion of history, then for modern social and economic problems, you're going to come up with false explanations. Like, remember that map I showed you of Lafayette's segregated neighborhoods? So if you think oh, we don't have to solve segregation today because that's just where people chose to live, you're not going to understand the historic causes of how we got to where we are today. And so then any solution you're going to come up with is going to be incomplete or mistaken, maybe even counterproductive. So you have to understand the historic causes of today's issues to come up with a correct solution. And I would say marginalizing people is both wrong and foolish. It's wrong because it's wrong, it's hurtful, but it's foolish because imagine, I'll use this example, imagine you're in a family, you live in their house, and but they disregard you all the time, they make fun of you, when they tell other people about their family, they don't even mention you, or maybe they say bad things about you, and then the roof starts leaking, they come to you and they say, hey, we want to help, you got to come up and help us put the new roof on. Well, why would you help improve the situation for your family when you're not even made to feel a part of that family? So yeah, we have a lot of good things about our community. We also have things that need improving. So how can we work together as a community if we can't even trust one another? If we're, to say what we care about one another. So it's really important not to marginalize people. And just like any relationship you have, marriage, friendship, even a business partnership, trust has got to be the foundation of that relationship, or you don't have a relationship. Same thing, if we don't have trust in our community, that people can be honest about the past, then why would I, if you can't admit what's happened in the past, why would I believe you now if you say what we're going to do now or about the future? You've got to have that trust established. It has to be earned. And then when you do find people, understand people's story, you can have understanding and empathy and compassion, and then you can have forgiveness and healing for those wounds. And so then we can work together to have a better tomorrow. Thank you. My wife is saying, before anyone goes, I want to point out to you a resource you have. To help you out, I put that handout that I gave you, that timeline, there's a PDF of it. If you go to this website, there's a bunch of documents. That timeline is there. It's a PDF. You can download that and distribute it for free. These are all free, by the way. I'm giving them to the world, giving them to you. Don't pay me anything. Make a donation to some cause if you want. Don't give me anything. So there's the timeline there. There's a short handout, a one-page front and back handout that's sort of a typed up text-only version of all the PowerPoint, all the stats and figures and everything in this back format. There's also a 175-page book that I just happened to finish writing that simply is quotes from Confederate leaders showing where they all say, all of secession, forming the Confederacy, it's all about slavery. That's on there for free to download as long as it's only for not-for-profit educational use, so don't start selling it. So there's all these resources that I put up there, and I hope to, again, by 2020, have a book about, like a much larger book that expands on preservation today. Was that, Fred, you had something else you wanted to say?
Yes. This is not the end of the presentation. There is time allotment for asking questions.
Yeah.
And we want you to ask questions. But before you do so, I would like to ask Rick, would you explain the obstacle that is preventing the Moon statue from being moved from where it currently stands?
Okay, so I would say there's two obstacles, a legal and a political. The legal obstacle is that when the Daughters of the Confederacy gave the statue to the city was at one point going to move it, and the Daughters, back in, what year was that? I haven't followed the legality. 1980. And the Daughters of the Confederacy said, well, we'll let you keep the statue, but you have to promise that you can never move the statue. And they got, the city agreed to a court, like a permanent court injunction that said you can never move the statue. Now, as it turns out, no such thing in the law is ever permanent, so yes, that can be overcome, but that's the legal issue. But the political issue is just political will. That if not enough of the public supports, whether the parish or the city, really in this case, if the public doesn't support the city council in voting to have this moved to a museum, it's not going to happen. So even if the injunction is removed, you've got to convince the city council to say, hey, we want to come together as a community. This glorifies white supremacy. This glorifies the cause of the Confederacy, which was trying to enslave half the population of the parish, and still today about a quarter to a third of the parish population. That's not a man who we want to honor, to revere. Yes, we should remember him and remember the cause, but not honor or revere it. So until you reach that critical political mass, that to me is really the main issue. Because I think if you reach the political mass, there won't be a question, and people say, you know what, we can come up with a way to work around the law. Yeah.
At the end of my statement earlier, I asked that I ended by asking that you join Move the Mindset. And your help is needed to address that political matter Rick just mentioned. And to just go one step further with the injunction states that the statute is not to be moved unless the city decides it wants to build a road where it now sits, or unless the city wants to sell the property. Those are the two conditions that were agreed upon in 1980 in court. I still don't understand. It was the Daughters of the Confederacy who filed suit when the mayor tried to move the statue to the new courthouse building, which was the old Sears City Hall, which was the old Sears building. The mayor wanted to move it from its current location to the new City Hall building, and the Daughters of the Confederacy rejected that idea, brought it to court, and while in court, an agreement was made with the two conditions that I just mentioned. So it's going to take people power to get that statute moved. If you choose to join and work with us, that's the obstacle we have to overcome.
And I want to add, and I totally agree with everything you said. I want to add one other thing. You know, you said at the start, sometimes people falsely accuse people of saying, oh, they want to destroy the statute. I agree with you. I think that would be horrible to destroy it because it is a piece of history. But imagine this, like people say, oh, if you move it, it's erasing history. Well, no, history's already been erased. You're not going to erase. But think about this, right? So let's say we move the Mouton statue right here in this corner, and all the rest of the room tells the history of slavery, the Civil War, Reconstruction, Jim Crow. You're going to tell 100 times more history. So you're not erasing history. You're telling 100 or 1,000 times more history by moving it to a museum. It's the opposite of erasing history. So it's just a completely false, it's called a red herring. It's a false argument thrown out by the people who want to save the statutes. They say save the statue, right, as if we're going to destroy it. They want to keep it where it's at because they don't want this story told. They don't want the full history of the Confederacy to be told. They want to keep Alfred Mouton glorified. They want to say it wasn't about slavery. It was about, you know, states' rights or whatever. And they do want to keep glorifying him. We can remember him without glorifying him, and that's the key. All right, so question and comment. Yes?
The first bus service for African Americans at Paulboro in 1954. In 1954, we called a full-day boycott of Paulboro, a total boycott. And one of the contention was we wanted a bus.
1954, you said?
1954.
All right, thank you. Yes?
In 1973, they took the street that I lived on, another street, low-income white kids, moved out to W. Rosen and moved an equal number of black children to the same school. So they were still, that's another date, we're looking for some dates, in 1973.
1973, yeah.
They had not yet met that court order,
Right.
and so they continued to try to.
Yeah, it was a good 15 years before any actual integration happened in Lafayette Parish. 15 years of continual resistance. By what? Yes?
Assuming that the Mouton statue is moved, what do you predict will happen, if anything, after that?
Well, that's just, you know, to me, and this is just my perspective because I don't speak for any organization, the statute is a symptom. The statute is a symptom of racial attitudes in the city. So if the city says, you know, like as many cities have done in the South, you know, this doesn't represent who we are anymore. We want to be an inclusive society. We want to respect all the members of our community and treat it as equals, and we don't want to glorify someone who fought for white supremacy. Let's move it to a museum. But when those racial attitudes reach that point, then that means the city can start working on other issues like housing segregation, school segregation, the criminal justice system, all these sorts of things. So I think it's just going to be a natural outgrowth of that. They will have already developed this community working together, and then it'll expand to other issues. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's kind of its own end.
Can you speak louder? Can you speak louder?
I don't think
I'll repeat this question.
I don't think it needs to be justified in terms of its utility. I think it's
Oh.
an end in itself, which is not have that as thing for efficiency. I don't think it needs to be justified in terms of the utility of, what good comes out of it. I think it's an end in itself. I mean, it's a thing to be, a statute is a thing that you revere. So,
Yeah. Gentleman there?
Yeah. Move the mindset obviously means more than move the mouton. I mean, that's obvious, that's a synonym. And move the mouton just ain't happening until, as you said, there's critical mass. So my question is, we know there's ancient history, European history, American history, Southern history. How can this information become digested into one page in the history book, which is probably all it would get, and what existing class, because there's not going to be a class for this across the board in high schools. What would be your idea to get to the specific point? Because you don't get critical mass until it's widespread enough, and this kind of information reaches a young age. So my specific question is, what existing book or books or class where the text could include a page or two or more in Southern history for someone in Texas, Alabama, Mississippi, that would hit as sharply as this, which of course would be diluted and very difficult. Is my question clear? How can this be woven into part of, in realistic terms, part of the education?
Well, the same way any history is taught. I mean, how do we know about World War II or the founding of the United States? I mean,
But what course?
History and
what
civics.
book?
It'd be history and civics, and it'd be
Who will write those books and
textbook
who will get
writers.
approval?
Well, I mean, look, I can't snap a finger. I can't wave a magic wand, all right? You have to have textbook writers, and then it's parents that go to school boards and say, we want to have only approved textbooks, because the school boards have to pick. We say,
So that's
show
the
us
target.
school street.
That's the target, though. Is that what you say?
Well, I mean, it would be one of many.
Now,
Again, it's-
keep in mind, the history that's taught in history books today was the history that was written by Southerners. The daughters of the Confederacy had a mission to rewrite the history. And they literally went to school boards throughout the South and convinced the school boards to teach the Southern version of the Civil War and history. That's what they did, and they succeeded.
It was made legally required at the state
How
level.
can we do that now? Is what
The same way they did. The same way. Yeah.
Okay, you have a lady.
That's what I was going to say, is that the school boards approve the textbooks.
Right.
So if you know what textbooks they're approving, you can make a difference.
Yeah, and
gotta show
correct
up.
me if I'm wrong,
You got it, and
You-
somebody's got to write the textbook.
and correct me though, can't you go to like the Lafayette school system
School board
and inspect any of the textbooks to see what textbooks are being used?
Can you do that?
Right? Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm asking.
Yes, there would be a fight that we can take. There could be a fight that we can take on to teach not only Lafayette and Louisiana, but the whole country the true history of slavery, not just watered down version of what we heard throughout the years. That's like I said, we had a conversation earlier. What will we name it? One would, what we name it Black history. What we name it history.
History.
We're already
It's
teaching.
history.
We're already teaching history in the schools, but we're not teaching our part of history.
That's the issue.
So,
Correct.
so do we rewrite the history books to include us?
Yes.
Well, let's do that.
Yeah. That's what I'm
And
asking.
just that, let me introduce Mr. Elroy Broussard, who is a member of our local school board.
I just need to correct one thing. I see Paul Rose was the last segregated class, and I got some classmates here. The last segregated class at Paul Rose was 1970,
What year did I have?
71.
Oh, okay, thank you.
So 1970 was the last segregated class in the parish of Lafayette.
Hey.
Thank you.
Oh, oh.
Teresa, and then where else?
somebody back.
Okay.
Oh, a couple.
I'm wondering if it would be agreeable, besides having the history class, you know, just be history, there's probably some interest in a history class that specifically addresses what, I guess I'll change the name. I have a friend who teaches in Iowa American history from a Native American perspective.
At what level?
College.
See, that's the issue at colleges. You can afford to have the time for these specialized history classes. We have those at UL. There's Black history, American Southern history, history of slavery, all kinds of histories at UL, but you're leaving out the high school students. It's only those students who go to college and happen to choose those history classes because they're not required. So then really you need to reach the elementary high school students. And there was a couple, Sarah, I think there's a couple.
We have one right here.
Okay.
Ready, Marge?
I'm Marjorie Broussard, president of NAACP in Lafayette. We've investigated ways to teach Black history in our school system. There's no incentive to take the Black history classes. There is offered at the high school level, but it's not a part of the top criteria. Therefore, that needs to be changed. It needs to be a requirement and not just an elective, just like other subjects are required and not an elective. That's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Marge.
Oh, wow.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes, good evening. Recently, I went to a meeting, and the meeting was about redistricting. In the redistricting meeting, they was talking about bringing back neighborhood school. I went to neighborhood school, and within the neighborhood school, I asked the guy, which was Mike Heffernan, was he bringing back segregated school? Oh no, we can't use that word. So I told him, whatever color lipstick you put on the pig, it's still gonna go and it's gonna be a pig. And that's what they're doing, bringing back segregated school now. So just wanted to warn everybody about that. Oh, by the way, you said two things could get rid of that statue. One was the road. They selling the building. How much you want to sell it for? I'll buy
Back in the late 80s and 70s, there was a book published called Higher Education and Civil Rights Movement, White Supremacists, Black Southerners, and College Campus, edited by Peter Weinstein. Excellent reading.
Thank you.
Thank you. Where else you have, Eddie?
We have some questions?
Anything else?
Oh, right behind you.
I'm just curious if you've read Mitch Landrieu's book in the Shadow of Statues. I just got it recently. He did a book signing in New Orleans a couple weeks ago, and it's on this, and it's got some similar stuff in it, and it's just really interesting, kind of his perspective from the way he saw it in New Orleans and how things went down since he took those statues down. I just didn't know if you had seen it or had any opinion on that.
I have not had a chance to read that.
Really good.
You saw my dining room table. I have a stacks of books to read still.
Oh, okay.
Anybody else?
Is that a question? Oh, people up here.
It seems that everybody's asking questions, but really that's something that we all can do. We can support this effort. It takes people, comments and questions, fine. We all know what exists in Lafayette. I graduated from UL. I started there in 1958, and it was a pretty rough go, and I'm not too sure that the kids at USL or not UL, whatever they want to call it, not experiencing the same thing. So we want change in our community, you know. I'm willing to journey in with Fred and these other guys and see what we can do collectively, because if we go up there individually, we're not going to accomplish very much. This guy is a PhD. Some of us are college graduates, some of us are not. But all of us are citizens of Lafayette. And that's one thing that they can't deny. And I've watched Lafayette grow. and I've seen it grow in the wrong ways in a lot of ways. Parts of the community have been left out, sacrificed, and so forth. And we need to change it for the betterment of all the community. I never wanted to live in Lindell Gardens or whatever that thing is called on so I take on the responsibility to do the things I need to do for my community wherever I reside. Thank you.
Thank you.
Is a former school board member. Just want you to know that he understands the inner workings.
Continuing community leader, too.
And the community leader. And to pick up on something he said, if you want to join our effort, there's a list in the back of the room. If you are willing to list your name and your email address, I will be happy to send you an email when we have our meetings. We meet once a month, first Monday of every month, at one of the libraries, because it's very difficult to get a room at the library. There's so many organizations. But please do consider address of our meetings.
And Fred, I think that if anyone here, and I think you mentioned this before, if anyone here is a member of organizations that are not yet in a coalition with Move the Mindset, that would be the most powerful thing, to go back, have, talk to your members, talk to your board, maybe you're on the board, and say, hey, let's consider this. Is this something that we want to do, and why don't we support this? And that would really go a long way towards spreading this word. Yes.
My name is Kelly, and I was born in New Iberia, but I reside here in Lafayette Parish. I'm a product of a biracial marriage, and I knew about the timeline on when that was considered illegal. I commend you for the presentation, and I would offer to the audience that these are talking points, because this presentation clearly defines why we are where we are today among the racial lines, and it makes you get a better understanding of a different perspective of why a certain class is a certain way and another class is another. So I encourage everyone in the room to use this information as good talking points within your community, within your circle of friends, because this is really big, and we can really make history here in Louisiana where it all started.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. I could maybe show you the, you said they're talking points, and you're right, because I had to condense it into an hour. So if I'm not even sure that's going to work.
Control C.
Control C. Oh. No? Well, all right.
Oh, there she goes. Comes the one who knows what she's doing.
Yeah, doesn't my wife everyone? So these talking points, that's why I created a bunch of handouts, including a 175-page book of Confederate quotes, because that really gets to the heart of it. Well, at least specifically to the statute issue. That once people realized he was fighting for slavery, all the Confederates said they were fighting to keep people enslaved. The leaders, even I have a lot of Confederate generals that said that here, it was all about slavery, and everybody knew that. So even if you can't find a quote from Alfred Mouton that says, I was fighting for slavery, he knew what everyone else said was the cause of the Confederacy, so he knew that he was fighting for slavery. But I have, like I said, a text handout that sort of condenses all of these points in a myth-fact dichotomy, alternating myth and fact, just on a single page, double-spaced. You could print it as a one-page handout, give it to schools, organizations, drop it in mailbox, slip it on your block. I don't know, whatever you want to do with it. Again, it's free.
Question right there.
Another question.
Just a comment. My name is Dennis, and everyone in the room should know that anything you feel strongly about and you want to boldly pulpit once a month at the City Parish Council meetings, you get a 5-minute period of time when you can hold forth on anything you think is important to the community. And you will be heard by all the council members. Take the time to write yourself up a good statement, and then just come in there. My name is so-and-so. I'm a resident of so there's my councilman, and I have a problem with some of our history. And you just do a little. I was surprised to find out. Boom, boom, boom. Get him.
Get him. Get him.
Good idea.
Our organization made a personal appearance at the council meeting on the third Tuesday of this past month. It was on TV. We invited the parish council to come to tonight's meeting. We invited Lafayette, One Acadiana, the Lafayette Chamber of Commerce. We invited them. We invited all the school board members. We do have a parish council person with us tonight. Liz?
She just walked out.
Liz Webb was here.
She was here for the presentation.
Yeah.
And she just
Thank her
left.
for being present. We invited the Southwest Louisiana Black Chamber of Commerce. We invited 100 Black Men. We invited a number of organization leaders of this community. And do we have anyone here from the organizations I've mentioned?
Yes. I'm Waylon Gibbs, President of 100 Black Men of Greater Lafayette.
There you go.
Bishop Carlos Harvin, also a proud member of working with Waylon Gibbs and 100 Black Men.
School board.
School board.
School board's here.
Right. So we do have some of our Lafayette leaders who took us up on our invitation. There are still others that need to see this presentation, and eventually they will join us. So,
I saw someone here. Oh.
Where?
No.
I'm taking it back.
I think, is it Dr. Cobb? Dr. Cobb?
Yes.
Shelton Cobb. You were more than just a school board member, were you not?
President of the school board.
She was the president for years.
I'm Thelma West. I'm also a faculty member at UL. And I find it really surprising because I grew up in West Virginia. I grew up in West Virginia, and my history was not like the Lost Cause version. So really, none of this is a surprise to me.
Hold it up.
Okay, I said I'm from. Can you hear that? I'm from West Virginia. And my education was much different than what the Lost Cause was. And so none of this really is surprising to me because my version was not sugar-coated. Of course, I didn't know all the things.
Well, West Virginia seceded from Virginia and joined the Union. Oh, one other. Frank?
Frank.
And I'll tell you what, I'm going to, if you don't mind, we'll say the last comment.
Okay, and then we'll make an announcement.
Okay.
He's letting me share my idea. I'm Nicole, I'm his wife. So I think with a critical mass, I think the city council, once swayed enough, could sell that property for $1. It doesn't have to be difficult.
That's why I want to buy. I know it was down.
You want that triangle.
Cities that really belong to the people, they have to put it up for bid. You cannot sell it to a specific individual that they choose. So if you say you're going to put it up for sale, guess who's going to buy it?
We'll buy it first, Fred.
The mouton.
I'm Frank Robb. I'm the secretary of the Mindset. And I wanted to thank Dr. Swanson for this excellent presentation. It's the second time I've seen it. So. I can't wait to read the book, Fred.
Can't wait to have it done.
Yeah, it's done the way you're flying. I just wanted to let everyone know that we have another event coming up, and Margaret has been flyering for it. April 22nd, we're going to have another press conference and rally in front of the statue. This is just before festival. And we have, I think Fred mentioned this, we have about 11 groups that are signed on to endorse us. So it is a community event. I just want to invite everyone to be there. It'll be at 3 p.m. on a Sunday. And Yeah, it's going to be a good time. And this is part of that building critical mass. And, you know, the strategy is to go back to that city hall. We went there in 2016, thanks to Greg. Where's Greg Davis? He's out there somewhere.
He was right there.
He's in the hall. Standing in the hall.
Thanks to Greg, got us on the agenda there, but we were preempted by the Daughters of the Confederacy and their lawyer and this injunction we didn't know about, which was very much a sweetheart deal made in 1980 when you'd think that, you know, segregation was long over, but in fact...
only 10 years.
Well, yeah, and in fact, in terms of the power structure, it was very much alive. I think you told me, Rick, that was like the only permanent injunction that you could find in the state?
No, what I said was I looked up the law of permanent injunctions, and there's really no such thing as
there's no such thing
as an eternal injunction. So under the right circumstances, it could be.
So come to the April 22nd rally, press conference. If you're a member of an organization, be in touch with us. We'd like to get your endorsement. And again, we are building up for a return. We want to go to the city council, whether we're going to buy that land or break that injunction or get the city councilors to vote to take that thing down. We will do it now. When we started in 2016, I think we were ahead of the ball in terms of other states and cities around the South. And now there has been such a groundswell of, you know, removal of these statues that I think we need to catch up at this point. And so we want your support. Thank you.
Lafayette's going to catch up.
Thanks, Frank. Yeah, I mean, Shreveport's taken down their statue. Okay, the idea that Shreveport is more progressive than Lafayette.
The preceding program was made possible in part with production assistance provided by AOC Community Media.